today we are continuing with Unbroken, and we're starting in at chapter 13, which is called Missing at Sea, and starts on page 137. You might remember that at the end of our last chapter, the only three survivors from the plane crash were Louie, Mac, and Phil. Mac was not doing well. He's not injured, but he definitely was having a hard time staying in his right mind. Louis has cracked his ribs, although he doesn't know that, and Phil is bleeding. He's losing a lot of blood. There are sharks swimming around them. And that's where we start here. So here we go. Remember to follow along as I read. Daisy May touched down on Palmyra late that afternoon. The crew had searched for Corkman's plane all day, but had seen no trace of it. Daisy had dinner and then went to the base theater. He was watching the film when someone told him to report to the base commander immediately. When he got there, he was told that Green Hornet had never come in. Holy smoke, he said. He knew that there were two possibilities. One was that Philip's crew had turned back to Hawaii. The other was that they were, as Daisy phrased it, in the drink. Someone went to check with Hawaii. Knowing that if Green Hornet was indeed down, they'd still have to wait until morning to search, Daisy went to bed. At around midnight, a sailor woke Daisy's radio man, Herman Skeers, and told him that Phil's plane was missing. The Navy wanted to check Skeers's radio log to see when the last contact with the plane was. Skeers asked the sailor to wake Daisy, and he, Daisy, and Navy officials reviewed the log at the base office. It yielded little information. At 4:30 a.m., Green Hornet was declared missing. Two planes were now down, Corkman's and Phillips's, taking 21 men with them. The Navy assumed command of the rescue effort. Once the sun was up, Daisy May would be sent out along with at least two Navy flying boats and at least one other AAF plane. Because Daisy May and Green Hornet had flown side by side early in the journey, the searchers knew that Green Hornet had not crashed during the first 200 miles of the trip. It had apparently gone down somewhere between the point at which Daisy May had left it and Palmyra, a stretch of 800 miles. The trick was figuring out the direction in which any survivors would be drifting. The ocean around Palmyra was a whirl of currents, lying at the meeting point of the westward carrying north equatorial current and the eastward carrying equatorial countercurrent. A few miles of difference in latitude could mean a 180-degree difference in current direction, and no one knew where the plane had hit. The search area would have to be enormous. So they not only have to think about where the plane would have crashed, but they also need to be aware of what direction the ocean currents would be carrying the raft that the men are in. Each crew was given search coordinates. From Palmyra, Daisy May would fly north. From Oahu, several planes would fly south. Not long after sunup, the planes took off. Everyone knew that the odds of finding the crew were very long, but, said Skeersy, we kept hoping. Louis woke with the sun. Mac was beside him, laying back. Phil lay in his raft, his mind still fumbling. Louis sat up and ran his eyes over the sky and ocean in search of rescuers. Only the sharks stirred. Louis decided to divvy up breakfast, a single square of chocolate. He untied the raft pocket and looked in. All of the chocolate was gone. He looked around the rafts. No chocolate, no wrappers. His gaze paused on Mac. The sergeant looked back at him with wide, guilty eyes. The realization that Mac had eaten all of the chocolate rolled hard over Louis. In the brief time that Louis had known Mac, the tail gunner had struck him as a decent, friendly guy, although a bit of a reveler, someone who likes to party a little bit, confident to the point of flippancy. The crash had undone him. Louis knew that they couldn't survive for long without food, but he quelled the thought. A rescue search was surely underway. They'd be on Palmyra later today, maybe tomorrow, and the loss of the chocolate wouldn't matter. Curbing his irritation, Louis told Mac that he was disappointed in him. Understanding that Mac had acted in panic, he reassured him that they'd soon be rescued. Mac said nothing. The chill of the night gave way to a sweltering day. Louis watched the sky. Phil, weak from blood loss, slept. Mac, a shade short of being a redhead, burned in the sun. He remained in a dreamy, distant place. All three men were hungry, but they could do nothing about it. The fish hooks and line were useless. There was no bait. As the men lay in silence, a purring sound began drifting gently between their thoughts. Then all three realized that they were hearing a plane. Searching the sky, they saw a B-25 high up and well to the east, flying much too high to be a search plane. It was probably on its way to Palmyra. Louis lunged for the raft pocket, retrieved the flare gun, and loaded a flare cartridge. He couldn't stand in the soft-bottom raft, so he tipped onto his knees and raised the gun. He squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in his hand, and the flare, roaring red, streaked up. As it shot overhead, Louis dug out a dye pack and shook it hurriedly into the water, and a pool of vivid greenish yellow bloomed over the ocean. With the flare arcing over them, Louis, Phil, and Mac watched the bomber, willing the men aboard to see them. Slowly, the flare sputtered out. The bomber kept going, and then it was gone. The circle of color around the rafts faded away. The sightings left the castaways with one important piece of information. They had known that they were drifting, but without points of reference, they hadn't known in which direction or how fast. Since planes on the north-south passage from Hawaii followed a flight lane that ran close to Green Hornet's crash site, the appearance of a B-25 far to the east almost certainly meant that the rafts were drifting west, away from the view of friendly planes. Their chances of rescue were already dimming. That evening, the search planes turned back for their bases. No one had seen anything. They would be back in the air at first light. Over the rafts, the daylight died. The men took sips of water, bailed seawater around themselves, and lay down. The sharks came to the rafts again to rub their backs on the undersides. So thinking about where Louis is at right now, they have no food. Mac, one of the three men, ate all of their food in one night. They're supposed to last them days. They have very limited water, and it looks like no one will be able to find them because of how far they've already blown off their initial course. Continuing. Phil slept for most of the next day. Louis sipped water and thought about food. Mac continued to hunker down, speaking little. For another day, rescue did not come. It was sometime early the next morning, May 30th, when Louis, Mac, and Phil heard a broad, deep rumble of B-24 engines, the sound of home. Then there it was, low and right overhead, a blunt-faced whale of a plane heading southeast, plowing through the clouds, disappearing, and reappearing. It was a search plane. It was so near the rafts that Louis thought he recognized the insignia of their squadron, the 42nd on the plane's tail. Louis grabbed the flare gun, loaded it, and fired. The flare shot straight at the bomber. For a moment, the men thought it would hit the plane, but the flare missed, passing alongside the plane, making a fountain of red that looked huge from the raft. Louis reloaded and fired again. The plane turned sharply right. Louis fired 2 more flares past the tail. The plane was Daisy May. Its crewmen were straining their eyes at the ocean, passing a pair of binoculars between them. Searching was difficult that day, with loaves of clouds closing and parting, offering the men only brief glimpses of the sea. Everyone felt a particular urgency. The missing men were their squadron mates and friends. If we ever looked for something on a mission, remembered Skeers, that day we were looking. The flares spent themselves, and Daisy May flew on. No one aboard saw anything. The plane's pivot had only been a routine turn. Louis, Phil, and Mac watched Daisy May's twin tails grow smaller in the distance, then disappear. For a moment, Louis felt furious with the airmen who had passed so close to them, yet had not seen them, but his anger soon cooled. From his days searching for missing planes, he knew how hard it was to see a raft, especially among clouds. For all he knew, he too had overlooked raft-bound men below him. But what had probably been their best chance of rescue had been lost. With every hour, they were drifting farther west, away from the flight lanes. If they weren't found, the only way they could survive would be to get to land. To their west, they knew, there wasn't a single island for some 2,000 miles. If by some miracle they floated that far and were still alive, they might reach the Marshall Islands. If they veered a little south, they might reach the Gilberts. If they're lucky enough to drift to those islands rather than passing by and out again in the open Pacific, they'd have another problem. Both sets of islands belonged to the Japanese. Watching Daisy May fly away, Louis had a sinking feeling. As the castaways watched their would-be rescuers disappear over the horizon, not far away, George Smitty Smith, who had sat up the night before the crash talking to Phil about Cece, was piloting his B-24 over the ocean, searching for any sign of the lost men. About 50 miles short of Barber's Point, based on the leeward side of Oahu, his crew spotted something. Spiraling in for a closer look, Smitty saw a muddle of yellow rectangular boxes jostling on the surface. Large fish were circling them. The boxes had not come from Green Hornet. They were too close to Oahu to have traveled that far, especially as the currents wouldn't have carried them in that direction. But Corpening's plane had probably gone down somewhere along the north-south flight lane, the lane over which Smitty was searching. The boxes may well have been the last remains of Corpening's plane and the men aboard it. The boxes weren't the only sighting that Smitty had that day. In the same region where the Green Hornet had crashed, he spotted a shock yellow object bobbing in the water. He swung his bomber down toward it. It appeared to be a provisions box, like the ones carried on B-24s, but he wasn't sure. Smitty flew loops around the box for 15 minutes. There was nothing anywhere near it, no debris, no rafts, no men. Smitty probably believed that he was looking at a piece of Phil's plane, and if he did, he was probably right. He flew back to Oahu, thinking of his friend Cece and all the pain she would feel when she learned that her fiancé was missing. On Oahu, the men of the 42nd Squadron were losing hope. Cupernell, Phillips, Zamperini, the Olympic miler, and Mitchell lost on their way to Palmyra, a ground crewman wrote in his diary. I find it hard to get used to such a thing. Just the other day I drove them all to Kahuku and around, kidded with them, but now they're probably dead. The other pilots act as though nothing has happened, and speak of sending the other fellows' clothes home as though it were an everyday occurrence. That's why it has to be played, because that's the way it is. It's an everyday occurrence. Remember, now that World War II is underway, things like this are happening more and more, and they've been having problems with the B-24s all throughout, which is really our foreshadowing for this moment in the book. The castaways' bodies were declining. Other than Mac's feast on the chocolate bars, none of them had eaten since their early morning breakfast. Let me zoom for it a little bit. Oh, sorry. There you go. Breakfast before their last flight. They were intensely thirsty and hungry. After the B-24 sighting, they spent another frigid night, then a long fourth day. Remember, frigid means really cold. There were no planes, no ships, no submarines. Each man drank the last drops of his water. Sometime on the fifth day, Max snapped. After having said almost nothing for days, he suddenly began screaming that they were going to die. Wild-eyed and raving, he couldn't stop shouting. Louis slapped him across the face. Mac abruptly went silent and lay down, appearing strangely contented. Maybe he was comforted by Louis's assertion of control, protected thereby from the awful possibilities that his imagination hung before him. Mac had good reason to lose faith. Their water was gone. After the B-24s had passed over, no more planes had come, and the current was carrying them far from the paths trafficked by friendly aircraft. If the search for them hadn't been called off, the men knew it soon would be. That night, before he tried to sleep, Louis prayed. He had prayed only once before in his life, in childhood, when his mother was sick, and he had been filled with a rushing fear that he would lose her. That night, on the raft, in words composed in his head, never passing his lips, he pleaded for help. So just to himself, silently, Louis just praying that they would be able to survive. As the lost men drifted farther and farther out of reach, their last letters reached their families and friends who did not yet know that they were missing. It was apparently military policy to wait for initial searches to be conducted before informing loved ones. On the day after the crash, Phil's final letter to his father arrived in Virginia. Reverend Phillips, who called his son by his middle name, Alan, had joined the Army and was now Chaplain Phillips at Camp Pickett. The last news of Alan had reached him weeks earlier in newspaper stories about Superman's saga over Nauru. Chaplain Phillips had carried clippings about the raid to the offices of a local newspaper, which had run a story on Alan's heroism. As proud as he was, Chaplain Phillips was also frightened. I sure hope that's the closest call he ever has, he wrote to his daughter. It was probably this fear that had led Chaplain Phillips to write to Alan to ask about the fate of the raft-bound men his crew had found, encircled by sharks that spring. So as they're talking about Alan, that's Phil, who's in the raft with Louis, and then Reverend Phillips, Chaplain Phillips, is going to be his dad. In his last letter to his father, Alan was reassuring. The men were all safe. As for himself, Alan wrote, I'm still in the same place I have been. I'll write again soon. So long for now, Al. On the weekend after the crash, Pete, Virginia, and Louise Zamperini made an impromptu visit to the home of Cupernell's parents, who lived in Long Beach. It was a merry meeting, and they all talked of their boys. After the visit, Pete wrote to Louis, asking him to tell Cuppernell that his parents were doing great. Before sealing the envelope, he tucked in a photo of himself, smiling. On the back, he had scribbled an inscription, "Don't let 'em clip your wings." In Saranac, California, Peyton Jordan opened the letter that Louis had tossed out the window of the Green Hornet as the plane taxied for its last takeoff. "Dear Peyton and Marge," it read, "I'm still alive and kicking around. Why, I don't know." That little turkey'd better take care of himself, Jordan thought. Phil's last letter to Cece reached her in Princeton, Indiana, where she was finishing her first year as a high school teacher. In his letter, Phil had written of the moon over Hawaii and how it reminded him of the last time he was with her. "I never will forget that time I spent there with you. There are a lot of things which I'll never forget while I was with you, sweet. I'm waiting for the day when we can begin doing things together again as we used to do." He closed his letter as he had so many others. "I love you, I love you, I love you." No more messages would come from the lost men. Pete's letter to Louis made its way to the postmaster in San Francisco, where the 11th Bomb Group's mail was sorted. Someone wrote "Missing at Sea" on the outside and dropped it back in the mail to Pete. A week had passed since Green Hornet had vanished. Intensive searching had yielded nothing. Every man on Phil's crew was officially declared missing, and in Washington the process of informing family members was set in motion. The men from Daisy May were told to return the plane from Palmyra to Oahu. The search had been abandoned. The crew was dejected. They wanted to go on looking. As they flew back to Oahu, they talked of the lost men. Keep in mind they've been missing for a week, so no food and water, out in the hot sun, cold at night, sharks all around them for a week. At Kualoa, a second lieutenant named Jack Cray walked into the cottage to perform the grim duty of cataloging the men's things and sending them to their families. Louis's room was mostly as it had been when Louis had walked out that Thursday morning. Clothes? A footlocker, a diary that ended with a few words about a rescue mission, a pinup of actress Esther Williams on the wall. The note that Louis had left on the locker was gone, as was the liquor. Among Louis's things, Cray found photographs that Louis had taken inside his plane. In some of them, Louis had forgotten to aim the camera away from the Norden bomb site, so Cray had to confiscate those. The rest of Louis's belongings were packed into his footlocker and ready to be sent to Torrance. On the evening of Friday, June 4th, Phil's mother, Kelsey, was in Princeton, Indiana. In the absence of her husband and son, she had sold the family house in Terre Haute and moved to Princeton to be closer to her daughter, Martha, and future daughter-in-law, Cece, with whom she had become dear friends. That evening, when Kelsey was visiting Martha, someone brought her a telegram. "I regret to inform you that the Commanding General, Pacific Area, reports your son, First Lieutenant Russell A. Phillips, missing since May 27th. If further details or other information of his status are received, you will be promptly notified." The telegram reached the Zamparinis that same evening. Louise, called Sylvia, who had recently married a firefighter, Harvey Flammer, now lived in a nearby suburb with her husband. Upon hearing that her brother was missing, Sylvia became hysterical, sobbing so loudly that her neighbor ran to her. When the neighbor asked her what was wrong, Sylvia was crying too hard to speak. Eventually, she pulled herself together enough to call Harvey at the fire station. She was frantic and confused and didn't know what to do. Harvey told her to go to her mother. Sylvia put the phone down and ran straight out the door. Sylvia sobbed for the entire 45-minute drive. Weeks before, just after the Nauru raid, she had picked up her morning paper and seen on the front page a photograph of Louis looking haunted, staring through a gaping hole in the side of Superman. The image had horrified her. Now, as she absorbed the news that Louis was missing, she couldn't stop seeing that image. When she pulled up at her parents' house, she had to compose herself before she walked in. Her father was calm but quiet. Her mother was consumed in anguish. Sylvia, who like the rest of the family assumed that Louis had gone down in the ocean, told her mother not to worry. "With all those islands," Sylvia said, "he's teaching someone hula." Pete arrived from San Diego. "If he has a toothbrush and a pocket knife and he hits land," he told his mother, "he'll make it." Perhaps that day, or perhaps later, Louise found the tiny snapshot that had been taken on the afternoon Louis left, when he had stood beside her on the front steps, his arm around her waist. On the back of the photograph, Louise wrote, "Louis reported missing, May 27th, 1943. Just as you're reading this, just try and picture yourself in this family's footsteps as they're trying to understand what happened and they want to hold on to hope for Louis. And also, they're just really scared about what could have happened to him. They're not sure if he's alive or not. Here we go. The news of Louis' disappearance headlined California newspapers and led radio broadcasts on June 5th. The Los Angeles Evening Herald and Express ran a feature on the life of Zamp, which looked an awful lot like an obituary. An obituary is what would go in the newspaper when someone dies, and it's just a story about their life. Peyton Jordan, now a Navy officer, was driving to his base when he heard the news on the radio. Jordan gasped. He drove into the base feeling numb and for a while did nothing at all. Then he started speaking to his fellow officers. Jordan's job was to train cadets in survival techniques, and he and the others considered the possibilities that might face Louis. All of the officers agreed that if Louis had the right training, he might survive. Pete called Jordan, and they talked about Louis. As Pete spoke of his hope that Louis would be found, Jordan could hear his voice wavering. Jordan thought about calling Louis' parents, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had no idea what to say. That evening, he drove home and told his wife Marge, who had known Louis well at USC. They moved through their routines in a quiet fog, then went to bed and lay awake in silence. In Torrance, Anthony Zamperini, that's Louis' dad, remained stoic or serious without emotion. Louise cried and prayed. From the stress, open sores broke out all over her hands. Sylvia thought her hands looked like raw hamburger. She's so stressed that she's getting sores. Somewhere in those jagged days, a fierce conviction came over Louise. She was absolutely certain that her son was alive. On Samoa, Stanley Pillsbury and Clarence Douglas were still in the hospital trying to recover from the wounds incurred over Nauru. Douglas's shoulder was far from healed, and to Pillsbury he seemed emotionally gutted. Pillsbury was in considerable pain. The doctors had been unable to remove all of the shrapnel from his leg. So from the explosion, he got bits of metal in his leg. And he could feel every shard burning. He wasn't close to being able to walk. In his dreams, planes dove at him endlessly. Pillsbury was in his bed when Douglas came in, his face radiating shock. The crew went down, he said. Pillsbury could barely speak. His first emotion was overwhelming guilt. If I had only been there, he said later, I could have saved it. Douglas and Pillsbury said little more to each other. They parted, each man swimming in grief. Douglas would soon be granted transfer back to the States. Pillsbury would linger on his cot in Samoa, hoping that he would one day walk again. On Oahu, Louis' friends gathered in a barracks. In the corner of one of the rooms, they hung a small flag in memory of Zamp. It would hang there as Louis, Phil, and Mac drifted west, and the Allies, the 11th Bomb Group's 42nd Squadron among them, carried the war across the Pacific and into the throat of Japan. Now, we have talked a lot in the past about the war with Germany and with Europe, but this is really important that the U.S. is starting to fight Japan. That's important to our story, and I want you to keep that in mind as we head into chapter 14.